Your Honor, we next call Professor Lee Badgett.
Raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. State your name, please.
Lee Badgett.
And spell your last name.
Badgett, B-A-D-G-E-T-T.
And your first name?
It's Lee, L-E-E.
Thank you.
Good morning, Professor Badgett.
Good morning.
Now, we will, as is the custom, have some binders to pass out to you in the court, but let me just begin by asking you some background questions. Where are you presently employed?
I'm employed at the University of Massachusetts Amherst.
And what is your position there?
I am both a professor of economics and I direct the Center for Public Policy and Administration.
Do you have any other positions?
I am also research director at the Williams Institute at UCLA.
And how long have you been the research director at the Williams Institute?
It's been about 4 years.
And how long have you been at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst?
Since 1997.
Be sure to keep your voice up.
Okay, I'm sorry.
And I assume that you have a bachelor's degree?
I do have a bachelor's degree from the University of Chicago and a PhD in economics from the University of California, Berkeley.
Your Honor, we have given counsel for the defendants a list of exhibits, and I would this time offer, unless there is some objection.
Your Honor, I do have an objection to some of the exhibits. It appears that a few of them have not been cited or relied upon by Professor Badgett in connection with her expert development of her expert opinion in this case, and were not available and not used in her deposition. Now, perhaps if Mr. Boies is going to cite them and rely on them as testimony unfolds, I can offer an objection at that time. But I am concerned that these, that there are 4 or 5 exhibits that were not available.
Can you identify the 4 or 5 so that we can then exclude those for the moment and take care of the rest of them?
Yes, Your Honor. PX 0188.
0188.
PX 0189. PX 1296. PX 1298. And PX 1309. PX 234.
I'm sorry, what was the...
PX 1309.
1309.
PX 2345, PX 2346, and PX 2347.
Read the last one, please.
PX 2347.
All right. Then a possible objection is noted as to those exhibits. I gather there's no objection to the remainder that Mr. Boies intends to offer. Is that correct?
I believe not, Your Honor.
Very well. Then, Mr. Boies, if you would just...
Thank you, Your Honor.
If you'd be so good as to give the list of those exhibits that you are moving in to the clerk with a note that, with the exception of those referred to by Mr. Cooper, the remain shall be admitted.
Yes, I will, Your Honor. Now, if I could get...
if you could get some attention from your colleagues.
Attention from my helpers.
Perhaps this is a good time to take a break. Why don't we take until 25 after the hour?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very well. Did we get all the documents straightened out?
Yes, we did, Your Honor, and we have given the court a list of the documents to be admitted.
Very well.
I would offer them at this time.
And Your Honor, we have straightened out a lot of the confusion. There are still 2 documents remaining on the list, which my previously stated objection still stands to, and that's PX 2345 and PX 2346.
Do I understand as to the others the objection is withdrawn?
It is withdrawn as to the others, but only provisionally with respect to PX 0188 and PX 0189. The representation has been made by Mr. Boies' colleagues that although these documents were not cited in the materials relied upon by the witness before the deposition, they apparently were provided to my colleague before the deposition through a different transmission. I have no doubt that that's correct. Once we do confirm that, this provisional concern will be withdrawn.
All right, very well. Well, that was time well spent. Proceed, Mr. Boies.
Thank you, Your Honor. Professor Badgett, have you written a number of peer-reviewed articles on the subject of gay and lesbian relationships and gay and lesbian marriages?
Yes, I have 5 or 6 peer-reviewed articles in several science journals and about the same number in law reviews.
And are some of those listed on PX 2321, which was your resume, which was admitted into evidence?
Yes, those should have all been cited there.
Now, in addition to the articles, have you written any books?
I have written 2 books, co-edited, and a third. One was called Money, Myths, and Change. That was published by the University of Chicago Press, which is also peer-reviewed, which is also a peer-reviewed process. And then most recently the book When Gay People Get Married, which was published by New York University Press, also a peer-reviewed process.
When, excuse me, gay people get married, what happens when the societies legalize same-sex marriage? Is this the book you're referring to?
Yes.
And this is Plaintiff's Exhibit 1273, which has been admitted. Now, in 2008, did you co-author any materials relating to the impact of same-sex marriage?
Yes. Well, in 2008, I probably co-authored quite a few, but some in particular related to California.
And what was that?
A colleague and I estimated that fiscal impact of allowing same-sex couples to marry on the state of California's budget.
And that is marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit 1268, which was admitted without objection. And in 2005, did you co-author an article in the Stanford Law and Policy Review?
Yes. That one was an earlier effort to make more or less the same analysis, looking at what the impact would be of allowing same-sex couples to marry on the California budget at that time.
And that is Plaintiff's Exhibit 1283, correct?
Oh, should I take a look? Yes, that's at the time article.
Now, have you, in addition to your research, your reaching duties at the universities that you identified, have you been invited to speak and make presentations at other universities?
Yes, I have. I have been invited to speak on this topic and related topics at many universities in the U.S. and in other parts of the world. Here in the U.S., in the last few years, I've spoken at the University of Illinois, Chicago, University of Minnesota, Duluth, Yale University, University of Kentucky, UCLA, University of Massachusetts, Smith College, Amherst College, probably some others that I can't remember. In other countries, and actually, I've been invited to speak at law schools as well here in the U.S. I should mention those at this point. I have given talks on this issue at Yale Law School, Temple University Law School, University of Connecticut Law School, Washington and Lee Law School, all in the last few years. I've spoken at the University of Toronto in Canada, King's College in London, University of Amsterdam, University of Stockholm, Linz University in Austria, all on the subject for same-sex couples.
Now, you're familiar with the American Psychological Association, correct?
Yes, yes, I'm a member, but I'm, yes, I'm not a member, but I am familiar.
And what is Division 44? You've made references to that before.
Division 44 is the section of the APA that focuses on lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender concerns.
And have you ever spoken to that group?
I have on several occasions, but on one occasion I gave an invited presidential address to APA. It was the president of Division 44 who invited me.
And what is an invited presidential address?
The president of the division has the option, has the ability to choose a person that they would like to come speak on a topic before the entire APA convention, potentially. So it's not just limited to Division 44 members.
Now, have you had papers accepted for conferences organized by various professional associations?
Yes, I have submitted papers for review, and I have had them accepted at many conferences related to economists. The Allied Social Science Associations, which is the big gathering each year. I have spoken at the American Political Science Association. Other presentations at the American Psychological Association. I was asked to give an invited talk to the National Council on Family Relations. I've spoken before the Canadian Population Society, the American Statistical Association, and some others.
Now, have you been asked to peer review articles that have been proposed for publication in journals related to same-sex couples and the effect of same-sex marriage or the absence of same-sex marriage?
Yes. I've been asked to review papers like that in many journals, including Demography, the Journal of Marriage and Families, the American Journal of Sociology, some economic journals, including Industrial and Labor Relations, Industrial Relations, a bunch of others as well.
Do those others include the American Sociological Review
Yes, I believe I have reviewed papers for them as well.
and the American Journal of Sociology?
Yes.
And have you ever testified before any government bodies?
Yes, in the last couple years, I have testified twice before Congress. Once was in front of the House Education and Labor Committee on the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. And more recently, last summer, I testified before the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform on the question of domestic partner benefits for federal employees. I have testified before several other state legislative bodies on different matters related to same-sex couples.
Can you give me some examples of state governmental bodies before which you have testified?
I've testified before the California Senate Taxation and Finance Committee, I believe it's called. I have testified before committees in Alaska, in Massachusetts, in Hawaii, in New Hampshire, Maryland, I believe, on these issues.
Your Honor, we would offer Professor Badgett as an expert on demographic information concerning gays and lesbians, same-sex couples, and children raised by gays and lesbians, as an expert on the effects of the exclusion of same-sex couples from the institution of marriage, and as an expert on the effect of permitting same-sex couples to marry on heterosexual societies and the institution of marriage.
Mr. Cooper of voir dire?
No, Your Honor.
Very well, you may proceed.
Thank you. Professor Badgett, let me ask you to look at demonstrative 10. And in connection with that, ask you to tell the court what basic opinions you are offering today.
Well, this demonstrative summarizes those opinions. The first one is that Prop 8 has inflicted substantial I'd just like to go over again on these demonstrative. This demonstrative summarizes those opinions. The first one is that Prop 8 has inflicted substantial economic harm on same-sex couples and their children who live here in California. I have the opinion that letting same-sex couples marry would not have any adverse effect on the institution of marriage or on different same-sex couples. And that same-sex couples are very similar to same-sex couples in most economic and demographic respects, related to marriage in particular. And then finally, that Proposition 8 has imposed some economic losses on the state of California and on counties and municipalities.
Now, with respect to the third opinion, could you state that third opinion again, please?
Yes. My opinion is that same-sex couples are very similar to different sex couples in most economic and demographic characteristics.
Let me turn to the first opinion that you have identified, which is your opinion that Proposition 8 inflicts substantial economic harm on same-sex couples and their children in California. First, what is the benefit, if any, that marriage confers on couples who marry and their children?
Well, economists have long identified several different economic benefits of marriage, and most of them relate to the fact that marriage is about commitment of two people. So in the context of a family, marriage and that commitment allows them to organize their lives more efficiently, dividing up labor in ways that improves the well-being of same-sex couples or of any couple and their children. And it might enhance their economic well-being, both through increasing the income for their family and the time that's available for the family. It also has an impact role in reducing what economists call transaction costs. That's the cost involved in making agreements of one kind or another. Probably the best example with regard to marriage is is two people who are married can avoid the cost, for instance, of hiring an attorney to write a will, because inheritance rights come along with giving or having a marriage. There are other specific benefits that sometimes come from third parties, such as the state or employee, who might offer specific benefits that are given to people who are married, but are not provided to couples who are not married. So these are some specific examples of how marriage has some very clear economic benefits for families.
Now, let me ask you to look at demonstrative number 11, which is a list that you prepared of how the inability to marry inflicts economic harm on same-sex couples in many ways. Now, do you see that?
Yes.
All right. Now, I would like to take you through that and ask you to explain what you mean by some of these points. Now, you say at the beginning that marriage confers numerous economic benefits, many of which are not provided by domestic partnership. Do you see that?
Yes.
And the first one is greater specialization of labor. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Well, the way economists look at families and couples is as an economic unit, kind of a little factory of sorts. And they take their time and money to produce the things that their families need, whether that's meals or entertainment or care for children. And families that can do that more efficiently are going to be better off economically. And the way to make that kind of division of labor more efficient is to have some people in these couples to actually specialize in certain types of labor, whether that's labor, getting training to enhance your job possibilities, or other sorts of training that would make you more productive in other ways.
Now, the second item you identify is reduced transaction costs. Could you explain what you mean by that?
The example that I gave earlier is about wills is a good example. So it's reducing the cost of making some kind of agreement. So that's one very clear-cut one that might just happen once otherwise. But as families' economic fortunes might change, a partner might become unemployed or might get a big raise or other circumstances change. And then the fact that the couple is married means that they don't have to renegotiate whatever deal they might have had as married partners. So they just don't have to keep talking about these different agreements. They have a marriage and understand what that means.
And the next item you identify is additional health and other insurance benefits. And I think there's been a lot of testimony about that already. The next item you identify is greater economies of scale. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Yes. Marriage is an institution that pulls two people together. Two people who very well might have been living separately. And when they move in together, they can have what economists call greater economics of scale, which basically means that they can live together as two people more cheaply, more efficiently than they would as two separates individually in two separate homes.
And the next item says stronger statement of commitment. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Well, in this case, we are getting to where marriage is quite different from domestic partnership. The value of marriage as a statement of commitment is something that is very important and underlines all of these other kinds of benefits, economic benefits. So marriage is something that allows the two individuals to say to each other that they are committed. It's a strong signal of commitment in that sense to each other. And secondly, it's a statement that is recognized and reinforced by people outside the marriage as a statement of commitment, an expectation that the two individuals will be committed. And that is, as I said earlier, that's what makes a lot of these other kinds of economic benefits of marriage possible.
And the next item that you have identified is greater validation and social acceptance of a relationship. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Well, I think I kind of combined that a little bit with the previous one, but the idea here is that marriage is not just a commitment between two individuals like a contract, but it's something that has in a social context quite a few other meanings that come from the fact that other people view it and might treat it, or the couple, differently as a result of their being married.
And the next item is more positive workplace outcomes from reduced discrimination. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Well, we have some research in psychology in particular that suggests that people who, gay and lesbian people in workplaces who believe they are being treated differently or are facing some sort of discrimination might actually have different kinds of work experiences and economic gains from the workplace. And in the case of a group of people like same-sex couples who are not allowed to actually marry, they may feel in the workplace context that they're being treated differently, perhaps, from their heterosexual coworkers who are allowed to marry and perhaps are married. And that affects, that effects of that feeling of discrimination might have an adverse effect on their work performance and therefore on their ability to make future economic gains, get promotions, get raises, that sort of thing. So that could have an adverse effect on their economic well-being.
Now, you say at the end that some of these costs may not be quantifiable, but they are substantial. What do you mean by that?
Well, these are costs these are effects of marriage that are well known in economics, but they are very different to quantify specifically. But in my opinion, they could be quite large. And some of these, we can come up with some approximations for the costs, such as the health and other insurance benefits. But in other cases, it's very different, actually, to come up with this precise dollar value.
Now, you say at the end, these costs are imposed on virtually all California same-sex couples who would marry if they could. What do you mean by that?
Well, I've thought about this from the perspective of two different groups of same-sex couples in California. One would be couples who have a domestic partnership, and the other group would be couples who don't have domestic partnerships. And I think the harmful effects will be similar for both groups. The couples who don't have domestic partnerships do not have any of the kinds of legal protections that marriage provides. But even those couples who do have a domestic partnership, in my opinion, are not getting the same kind of statement of commitment and social validation that would give rise to the full effect of the other possible benefits that they would experience if they were allowed to marry.
Now, did you say in that last answer that there were people who had domestic partnerships but nevertheless suffered costs because they couldn't get married?
Yes.
And you also said, I think, in that answer that there were people who chose not to have domestic partnerships but would marry. Did you say that?
Yeah, that is correct.
And what is your basis for that?
Well, I've looked at quite a bit of data here in the United States about this issue and have seen very clear evidence that there are many people who would marry but would not become domestic partners.
Let me ask you to please look at demonstrative 12. And could you explain what this demonstrative shows?
Well, this is an example of one of those pieces of evidence that I just mentioned. Here we are looking at the numbers of couples of same-sex couples who are married in the time period when they were allowed to marry in 2008, and comparing that to the number of couples who registered domestic partnerships in that same time period. And as you can see, they are quite different. Our estimate is that about 18,000 same-sex couples married during this time period, and only about 2,000 actually registered their domestic partnerships. And in fact, some of those were probably different sex couples who are also allowed. A small group of different sex couples are allowed to register domestic partnerships.
Now, in order to register as a domestic partnership, if you are a different sex couple, is there any special requirement?
Yes. At least one of those individuals has to be over 62. So couples in that situation actually have a choice. They can either marry or they can get a domestic partnership.
Let me ask you to please look at demonstrative 13. And could you explain what this means?
Yes, this is from a study I did a year or so ago where we gathered data from across the United States, from different states that allow same-sex couples to either marry or have civil unions or domestic partnerships. And we looked at the rate of take-up, is what we call it, a take-up rate for those different legal statutes. We compared the numbers of couples marrying in Massachusetts to the number of same-sex couples in Massachusetts over just that first year, to take into account the fact that these statutes have been available for different periods of time. And so what you see here is that 37% of same-sex couples in Massachusetts got married in the first year that they were allowed to do so.
Mm-hmm.
When we look at the states that allowed civil unions, only 12% of same-sex couples chose to enter into a civil union in that first year. And in looking at domestic partnerships in the states that offered those, we found that only 10% of same-sex couples in those states actually signed up for domestic partnership. And right below there, actually, we looked more specifically at California, which started allowing same-sex couples to register in 2000. And in that first year, only 5% of same-sex couples here in California registered as domestic partners. That's in the first year. And actually, if you think back to that previous slide, in just 6 months of having marriage available in 2008, about 21% of same-sex couples married. And in fact, if you kind of analyze that, you end up with a rate of marrying over the first year that would have been very similar to what we saw in Massachusetts, here in California, though.
Mm-hmm. Now, let me turn to those same-sex couples that are not registered, the ones that you're talking about. Mm. And in connection with that, let me ask you to look at demonstrative number 14. Mm. Now, am I correct that you are dealing here with those same-sex couples who, for one reason or another, would marry but would not register as domestic partners?
Yes, that's what I'm thinking about for this slide.
And can you explain what points you're making in this demonstrative?
Well, in thinking about the economic harm that those couples suffer from not being able to marry, some very specific, tangible financial effects would be that they may lack access to health insurance mm-hmm. and other employment benefits because the relationship would not be recognized by their employers. They are likely to be paying higher state income taxes. Mm-hmm. If they are fortunate enough to have an employer who covers their domestic partnership benefits or their unregistered domestic partner's benefits, I should say, then they will have to pay income taxes on that, mm-hmm. that benefit. They will not be able to file jointly, and the calculations that I have done suggest that a substantial number of couples would pay higher taxes because they are not allowed to file jointly. And then they will have these increased transactions costs that, further add to the cost of not being able to marry. And
I'm sorry, have you finished?
Yes.
Can you quantify the economic and non-economic costs to the same-sex couples who are not domestic partners from not being able to marry?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, it's very hard to actually quantify some of these costs. But the ones that we can quantify, like the access to health insurance and the tax burdens, are very likely to be in the thousands of dollars per year for each couple who has to bear them. We can get a sense of how many couples we're talking about here by thinking about the differences in the take-up rights between marriage and domestic partnerships. Mm-hmm. And that is likely to mean that thousands of same-sex couples in California are not registered partners and cannot marry. So if you were to multiply those thousands of dollars by the thousands of couples, you would have tens of millions of dollars in quantifiable costs for these couples if we added them up for the whole state.
Mm-hmm. Now, based on your research, can you explain why same-sex couples who would marry might not register as domestic partners?
There are a variety of reasons that I have seen in some academic research. Some of them have to do with the fact that individuals might see registered domestic partnership as a second-class status. Mm-hmm. because they don't have the choice as same-sex couples. Older same-sex couples do here in California, and so they might reject it for that reason. They also might see their just being of less value as a whole. In economics, we think about people making choices based on the value that they perceive of their different alternatives. Mm-hmm. The data suggests that when people have a choice, as they do in Massachusetts, they are just as much more likely to get married as they are to have a civil union or a domestic partnership. Mm-hmm. And that value, the difference in the value, the literature tells us, is that marriage is an institution that is recognized by many other people outside of the couple, and so it has that social validation that we talked about earlier. Mm-hmm. And also to the couple, to the two individuals and the couple themselves. Marriage has much more meaning than something like domestic partnership, mm-hmm. which has a much more clinical and businesslike kind of sound to it, to many couples.
Now, you said earlier in your opinion that the inability of same-sex couples to marry adversely affects the children raised by those couples. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Could you explain how that happens?
There are different ways that marriage can help children from an economic perspective. Mm-hmm. One is just the question of resources. If it's costing couples thousands of dollars a year in additional costs because they can't marry, then that's thousands of dollars that will not be available to spend on children, mm-hmm. or to save for their college education, or whatever parents might want to actually do with that, with the money. So that's one very important way where it hurts children.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you now to look at demonstrative 15, where you talk about the beneficial effects of same-sex marriage to couples and their children. And here you refer to a publication that is Plaintiff's Exhibit 1267 in evidence, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And what is that publication?
That was a publication that describes the results of a survey that my colleagues and I did of married people who are married same-sex partners in Massachusetts.
And how large was this survey?
Well, we did a survey with the Department of Public Health, and it was of a large group of people. We were interested in looking at the subsample of people who said that they were married to same-sex partners. And I believe we had 558 individuals in that part of the survey.
Now, was this a representative sample?
No, it wasn't a representative sample. But this was a sample that we got by drawing on a mailing list of a group in Massachusetts that was working with the Department of Public Health.
Now, despite the fact that it was not a representative sample, do you believe it provides a helpful point of reference?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I mean, we have 558 people who are married to same-sex partners in Massachusetts. It's a large group of people. Mm-hmm. And there are some indications that they are not very different from the larger group of married same-sex couples in Massachusetts. Mm-hmm. But as we point out in the publication, we know that this is not a random sample, so there might be some differences overall. But the overlap of experiences is likely to be there.
You referred to it as not a representative sample. Does that mean it was not a random sample, or a sample in which the exemplars were drawn randomly?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It was not a random sample or a probability sample, as we sometimes call it.
And you say from the survey over 72% of the respondents felt more committed to their partners as a result of marrying. Do you see that?
Yes.
And what is the significance of that?
Well, that, I believe, speaks to the issue that I talked about earlier, that marriage is a way for two individuals to form a more strongly committed relationship. Mm-hmm. And this survey, we asked individuals whether or not they felt more committed to their partners, whether they agreed or disagreed with that statement, and almost 3/4 agreed that they felt more committed to their partners.
Mm-hmm. The next statement that you make here is almost 70% felt more accepted by their communities. Do you see that?
Yes.
And what did you mean by that?
Well, again, that's a clear indication that the same-sex couples that we surveyed were experiencing that larger kind of social validation of their relationship that I talked about earlier, which is something that might well enhance the commitment.
And the last statement here says that 93% of the respondents that were raising children in their homes agreed or somewhat agreed that their children were happier and better off as a result of their marriage. Do you see that?
Yes.
And can you explain the significance of that?
Yes. 28% of the people who answered this survey had children that they were raising in their home. And almost all of them agreed that their children were better off, in the opinion of their parents. We also asked an open-ended question to allow parents to say more about what that might be, but what sort of effect there might be. And many of them spoke to the value of their children, of now being part of a family that looked like the families of the kids that they went to school with, or other kids in the neighborhood. The parents said that they themselves had actually found it easier to deal with people who are important people in their children's lives, whether that's teachers or healthcare providers, who had a clearer idea of what it meant to be a parent, to be a same-sex couple who are the parents of children. They were now able to see they are, married couples, and that in that context, they believed that they had an easier time of dealing with the people in their children's lives.
Now, this survey related to same-sex couples who married in Massachusetts, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, does that have any relevance to the question of same-sex couples and their children in California?
I think it does.
Why?
Well, for several reasons. One is the fact that it's in the United States, which has a very similar, relatively similar laws about marriage across the different states, to my understanding. Of course, I'm not a lawyer, but Massachusetts and California have very similar marriage rates. About 6 people per 1,000 in the population get married every year. So they're very similar. The same-sex couples in Massachusetts and California look very similar in their demographics of raising children and income levels and education levels. There are many similarities that lead me to believe and to have the opinion that I can apply similar findings from Massachusetts to California.
Let me ask you to look next at demonstrative 16. And this focuses directly on California, correct?
Yes.
And here you talk about, in your opinion, that Proposition 8 harms children being raised by same-sex couples in California. Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
And the first thing you say here is that same-sex couples in California are raising 37,300 children under the age of 18. Do you see that?
Yes.
First, where does that come from?
It comes from an analysis I did of public use data from Census 2000.
And you say that 1 in 10 of California's adopted children lives with a lesbian or gay parent. Do you see that?
Yes.
What is the significance of that?
Well, that suggests that many adopted children have a lesbian or gay parent who might want to marry at some point. And those children are likely to be better off if their parents are allowed to marry.
Do you have an estimate of what the number is of adopted children living with gay or lesbian parents?
Well, I don't remember the exact figure in California. I believe it was somewhere around 10,000 or so.
Let me ask you to look at Plaintiff's Exhibit 1264, which is in your binder. And when you have it, can you tell me?
I'm sorry, which page was that?
Particularly page 10, Table 5.
Oh. Okay.
Okay, page 10, which is Table 5. Okay.
Yes, okay. I think I understand it. So, okay, yeah. We estimated about 16,460 or so adopted children were living with gay or lesbian parents.
And are you aware of professional organizations who have taken the position that depriving same-sex couples of the right to marry harms the children being raised by those couples?
Yes, I've seen a report by a committee of the American Medical Association that makes that conclusion related to healthcare disparities that stem from reduced access to health insurance in particular.
I want you to turn now to your opinion that you stated earlier, that permitting same-sex couples to marry would not in any way have adverse effects, including any adverse effects on heterosexual marriage or the institution of marriage. Can you summarize the basis for that opinion?
Yes, I've looked at several sources of data from different angles, looking to see if any adverse impact has happened in the places where same-sex couples are allowed to marry.
Mm-hmm.
I have looked at demographic data. I have looked at the reasons for that same-sex couples give for marrying. I have looked at how they are treated after they are married by their heterosexual communities and families. I've looked at behavior of heterosexual individuals before and after same-sex couples are allowed to marry, and I have seen no evidence of any harmful effect of allowing same-sex couples to marry.
Mm-hmm. Now, in looking at that statistics experience of various jurisdictions in which same-sex couples have been allowed to marry, is it possible to translate that directly into a prediction of what might happen in California?
Well, it's important to be careful in doing that. There may be particular trends that are already well underway for certain kinds of measures that you would want to take into account. You want to be sure that the data you use is the right data. It's important to take into account changes, other changes that are happening at the time that might influence the measures that you're looking at. Mm-hmm. So I do believe that it's important to proceed carefully.
Now let me ask you to look at demonstrative 32, which is a statement from Professor Douglas Allen, who is one of the defendant's experts. And did you review this statement by Professor Allen?
Yes, I remember reading it in his report.
And Professor Allen is one of the defendant's experts, and he presented an expert report. Is that correct?
Yes.
And would you read this portion of his expert report, please?
Okay. In the Netherlands, the total number of heterosexual marriages has slowly fallen since the introduction of same-sex marriage. Like most Western countries, this is no doubt part of a larger secular trend.
And is that an example?
Your Honor, excuse me, I'm going to object to this testimony. It relates to Professor Allen, as you have heard. Professor Allen was withdrawn as a witness early on in these proceedings, and we don't believe it's appropriate to introduce Professor Allen's opinions as though they are binding on the defendant intervenors.
Well, Mr. Boies?
Well, Your Honor, I wasn't suggesting that this is binding as a party admission. I was introducing it as evidence from the defendant's expert. Now, I think the fact that it comes from the defendant's expert may lead the court to give it greater weight than it might otherwise, but I do agree that the weight to be given this is within the court's jurisdiction.
Your Honor, I would only respond. It doesn't come from the defendant's expert. The defendant's considered using Mr. Allen, Professor Allen, as an expert, withdrew Professor Allen before this trial commenced, and he is no longer an expert of the defendant intervenor.
Is it not appropriate to place before the witness an opinion of another person in the same field that disagrees with the opinions being expressed by the witness, and to ask the witness her response to that contrary opinion? That is a fairly conventional way of dealing with an expert witness, is it not, Mr. Cooper?
Yes, Your Honor, and if presented in that fashion, I have no objection to it.
Very well. Then you may proceed, Mr. Boies.
Your Honor, the only thing I would say is that I'm presenting it in a slightly different context, in the sense that I believe that the witness will agree with the statement as opposed to disagree with the statement. But I still think it's appropriate to put in front of her a statement by another person in the field and ask her how she relates to that statement.
And that's what I understand you're doing and can do without objection from Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Your Honor. Professor Badgett, now that statement that was previously read from Professor Allen, which I won't repeat, do you agree or disagree with that statement?
I agree with the statement.
And is this an example of what you were talking about before, of something that has to be taken into account in applying the experience of other countries to what might happen in, for example, California?
Yes, that's a very good example of applying the experience from the Netherlands or even from Massachusetts.
Now, can I ask you to give some other examples of trends or facts that you would have to take into account if you were applying statistical information from other jurisdictions other than California to predict what might happen in California?
Well, I can think of a few examples of other changes that have taken place that show kind of unusual effects in demographic trends data. For instance, in 2005, when Spain began to allow same-sex couples to marry, they also changed their divorce laws and made it easier to divorce.
Your Honor, if I may, I'm going to have to object to this. This testimony that we are now hearing has not been testimony or in any way disclosed in the witness's expert report, in any of the expert reports. I believe I'm confident in saying that.
Is the objection that it goes beyond the scope of the witness's expertise?
No, Your Honor, it's not. It is that this information and this basis for her opinion was not disclosed prior to the time that she was deposed, and there was never an opportunity to depose the witness with respect to this information. This is the first time that the defendant interveners are hearing about this.
And by this information, you mean what, Mr. Cooper?
The information with respect to Spain and
divorce laws in Spain?
Yes.
Mr. Boies?
Well, Your Honor, what was clearly disclosed was the fact that the evidence, including the evidence from other jurisdictions, confirmed that the witness's general view that there would be no adverse effect on same-sex couples, that you had to look at those experiences to see their applicability. Now, all I'm doing here is giving is having the witness give some examples of that. An expert report is not intended to be word for word all the things that the witness is going to say or give all the evidence that the witness is going to rely on. What the expert report does under Rule 26 is that it provides them with notice of what those opinions are and what the bases are. And it doesn't purport to give them a word for word description of everything she's going to testify to.
Mr. Cooper?
Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, the expert's witness reports identified as number of pieces of information of this kind, primarily from the Netherlands, which is her expertise and on which she wrote a book, and which she is repeatedly referred to throughout her expert reports. And we had an opportunity, a fair opportunity, to cross-examine with respect to the particular empirical data on which she based her expert opinions as presented in her expert report. I have not heard of this empirical data before, and I have had no opportunity to examine it in its bona fides.
I understand that the objection is not that this testimony goes beyond the expertise that the witness is qualified to offer opinions on, and therefore I think it is appropriate, subject to which the witness can explore. I would permit Mr. Boies to pursue the matter, allow you to cross-examine the witness with respect to this, and if appropriate, you believe, you may make a motion to strike that part of her testimony. But let's hear the testimony. Let's see what the response is and give you a crack at trying to shake the witness from her opinions in this regard, Mr. Cooper.
Very well, Your Honor.
Professor Badgett, I'm not sure you completed your description of the example that you were drawing from Spain. Could you summarize that briefly, please?
Yes. So Spain made divorce easier at about the same time they allowed same-sex couples to marry. So you do see as divorce rate in Spain around 2005. So that's one example of a kind of a confounding effect that might occur that you would want to take into account when looking at data on trends, demographic trends.
Now, Mr. Cooper mentioned the Netherlands. Can you give us some examples of the Netherlands?
Yes, there are two good examples. In 2001, the Netherlands started allowing same-sex couples to marry. At that time, the law related to that change also allowed people who were in marriages to convert their marriages into registered partnerships, which made it possible then for those relationships to be dissolved more easily than a marriage could be dissolved. And there was a second change in that same year that increased the parental responsibilities of people who were in registered partnerships. So those are two fairly significant changes to the law that you would want to take into account when looking at data on trends and both marriage and registered partnerships in the Netherlands.
Now, Mr. Cooper had mentioned that you had talked about Massachusetts in your report. Is there any difference in applying experiences from Massachusetts, which obviously is another state, as opposed to applying the experience of other countries like the Netherlands or Belgium or Spain?
In my opinion, it would be more appropriate to look at Massachusetts because of the similarities, cultural similarities between different states here in the U.S. There would be less you would have to take into account than doing a simple comparison to the Netherlands.
Now, in looking at Massachusetts first, did you discern any evidence of adverse impact of permitting same-sex couples to marry in that state?
Your Honor, forgive me, Mr. Boies, but I have to assert an objection similar to the ones I have in the past. There was nothing in this witness expert reports which refer to any kind of demographic data of any kind of analysis of the harm or lack of harm from same-sex marriage in Massachusetts. I think this is going to relate to a couple of the exhibits that I objected to earlier, exhibits concerning population statistics from the CDC related
Population statistics in?
From the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control. But my point here is that the witness's expert report, her testimony at deposition, focused solely on her assessment of the lack of harm from same-sex marriage as she had studied that issue in the Netherlands. It did not relate to any empirical data of demographic data from Massachusetts.
Your Honor, first, we gave them her studies in Massachusetts that she testified about at her deposition at page 181, line 5. Question. Do you think the consequence for heterosexuals in California will be identical to the consequences for heterosexuals in Massachusetts from same-sex marriage? The answer was, to my knowledge, there have not been any changes for heterosexual couples in Massachusetts. I would not predict any for heterosexual people in California. So in that sense, yes, I think it would be the same. Now that's an example. They had every opportunity to ask her why she thought that. And again, the fact of the opinion is disclosed. The material that she relied on for that opinion has been disclosed. All I'm doing here is asking her to put the two together. There's no surprise here.
I assume the quotation from the deposition transcript is accurate, Mr. Cooper.
I don't deny its accuracy.
It does appear that the subject was explored at her deposition.
Your Honor, it is not true that the materials were disclosed relating to divorce and marriage statistics with respect to Massachusetts and other American jurisdictions. It was limited to these types of data concerning the Netherlands.
But it does appear from the question and answer that Mr. Boies read that the subject matter was explored at the witness's deposition, and that would appear to put you on notice that this is within the realm of her testimony that the witness was prepared to give. Very well. The objection will be overruled.
Now, let me see if I can remember where I was, Your Honor. Professor Badgett, I may have asked you this question, or I may have not, but I think it's a good place to continue the examination. Did you see any evidence of adverse impacts in Massachusetts on same-sex couples or different-sex couples or the institution of marriage or on children?
Maybe you better start over.
Yes, Your Honor, I agree with you. Did you see any evidence of adverse impacts in Massachusetts of permitting same-sex marriage on heterosexual marriage or the institution of marriage?
No, I saw no such adverse effects.
Did you see any evidence of adverse effects in Massachusetts of permitting same-sex marriages on children, either children being raised by same-sex couples or children being raised by different-sex couples?
No, I see no evidence of any such adverse effects.
Now, what does the Massachusetts experience lead you to conclude about whether there would be adverse effects of permitting same-sex couples to marry in California?
I believe that the same effect would occur here in California. That is that there would be no adverse effects in different sex couples or on the institution of marriage here in California.
Now, you also testified that one of your opinions was that there were many more similarities among same-sex couples and different-sex couples than there were differences between the two groups, and that any differences were marginal. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And what is that based on?
It's based on my analysis of census data for the state of California, comparing same-sex couples to married different-sex couples.
Mm-hmm. Now, let me ask you to look at demonstrative 37. And you say here that same-sex couples wish to marry for many of the same reasons that opposite-sex couples wish to marry.
Yes.
And you then list reasons, and I would like to ask you about that. You say, just as with different sex couples, same-sex couples are engaged in positive assortative matching. Do you see that?
Yes.
And what does that mean?
Oh, I see where you are. Yes. Yes. Well, that's a fancy economics and sociological concept, which basically boils down to similar people. People seek partners who are similar to them in many ways. So we see the same kinds of patterns for same-sex couples as we do for different-sex couples. People are partnering with people who have similar levels of education, similar race, similar age, and similar economic positions as well.
Birds of a feather.
And then you say that different sex couples and same-sex couples are seeking the same benefits associated with marriage, correct?
Yes, yes. And that's quite clear from the research from our study in Massachusetts. So that's one reason why couples are seeking to marry there in Massachusetts.
Now, I would like you to turn next to a statement that you made earlier about how preventing same-sex marriage imposes some quantifiable costs and losses on the state of California and its subdivisions. You recall that?
Yes.
And I would like to ask you how you would go about making such a conclusion, such a kind of quantification, because you said earlier that some of these costs were substantial but not quantifiable. Now you're talking about quantifying things.
Yes. Yes, it is possible to quantify those particular harms. People spend a lot of money on weddings, typically, and so we tried to figure out how much money would be spent by same-sex couples here in California if they were allowed to marry. Both couples who live here in the state and couples who would travel here from other states in order to get married. And we used data from the census to get estimates of couples. We looked at the rate of couples getting married in the first few years in Massachusetts. And about half of the couples there had gotten married within roughly the first 3 years. And we looked at that for couples in the state and estimated that about half of the couples here in the state would get married over that time period. We made estimates about how many couples from other states would come here based on the numbers of couples in those states. And again, although we think that about half of the couples might want to marry from other states if they were allowed to do so in the first 3 years, we know that not all of them will travel to California to do that. So we made various adjustments to take into account the fact that California draws tourists, heavily draws tourists from certain states. So in those states, we estimated higher numbers would be coming here. Higher proportions of the couples who want to marry would be coming here. We took into account the fact that now, well, if California did allow same-sex couples to marry, they would have some competition from not only Massachusetts, but now Iowa, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Connecticut. So we tried to make some adjustments about couples who might go there instead. In particular, we think couples from New York are much more likely to travel to one of those states that are very close by. So we all but eliminated New York from our calculations. And then we used data from the state bureaus here in California that estimate spending by tourists. And we looked at some studies on estimates of spending on weddings. And we took the number of couples who are likely to come here to get married, and we multiplied them by those different figures for the spending that we would expect them to have if they were to come here. And we then came up with one big number. I believe it was about $490 million over 3 years of increased spending here in California. And then we estimated how much of that spending would generate in sales tax revenues and hotel occupancy tax revenues that go to the state and to the counties and municipalities here in the state. And that figure was about 40 million.
Now, let me ask you to look at demonstrative 38. And this shows the $40 million over the 3 years that you just talked about. It then says there are other costs to state and local governments. Do you see that?
Yes.
And the first is general productivity losses.
Yes.
And could you explain what you mean by that?
Well, that relates back to my earlier point, that if gay and lesbian people or people in same-sex couples feel that they are being treated differently, they may not be as productive in the workplace. And that has potential broad economic harms to the state that will filter down to harmful impacts on state government in the same way that we talked about for the larger business spending and the economy.
Another cost to state and local governments, which you identify but do not quantify, is higher speaking on means-tested programs. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Yes, the state has some safety net programs for people who have low incomes. And if some of the effects on same-sex couples tend to reduce their incomes, then that will make them more likely to need and be eligible for those means-tested programs that are paid for by the state.
Another cost to the state and local governments that you identify but do not quantify is stated to be higher costs for health care of uninsured same-sex partners. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Yes, as I mentioned earlier, one of the important benefits of marriage from employers is the coverage of spouses on health care insurance plans. And to the extent that couples are not given, that same-sex couples cannot have access to those same benefits, then there will be uninsured people who might need to sign up for the state's version of Medicaid or the state children's health insurance program. And that will increase costs to the state. Or uncompensated care by uninsured individuals might also be costly to the state.
And another cost to the state and local governments that you identify but do not quantify that results from not permitting same-sex marriage is said to be loss of workers. Do you see that?
Yes.
And could you explain what you mean by that?
Well, people say, people, gay or lesbian people who either want to marry their current partner or want to have that option in the future might decide that California is not a good place for them to live, and they may move elsewhere in order to have that right.
And are you aware of any data or experience that supports the statement that you just made?
Yes, there are 2 pieces of information that a colleague of mine analyzed. One of them came from census data that showed that after Massachusetts started allowing same-sex couples to marry, there was a net influx of people in same-sex couples who came from the so-called creative class. These are people who are more likely to be scientists or inventors or artists, people who, according to some models of economic growth, are some of the drivers of economic growth. And those individuals appear to be attracted to Massachusetts. Perhaps because they are allowed to they are allowed to marry there. In the survey that we talked about earlier of the married individuals in Massachusetts, some of those individuals have moved recently since same-sex couples were allowed to marry, and they reported that that was one of the reasons why they moved to Massachusetts, if not the reason. It was in order to have the right to marry.
Your Honor, I have no more questions.
Very well. You may cross-examine Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Your Honor. Has the binder been presented to the witness? Fine, okay. Good morning, Professor Badgett.
Good morning.
My name is Charles Cooper. I represent the defendant intervenors in this case. It's a pleasure to meet you. Professor, you have long been an advocate for legalizing same-sex marriage, have you not?
I'm not sure what you mean by advocate.
Well, you have supported the legalization of same-sex marriage for many years, correct?
Yes, I have. I've been doing research on this topic for many years and have been a supporter
Be
of
sure to keep your voice up.
Oh, I'm sorry.
What was the answer?
The answer was yes. Yes, I've studied this issue for many years, and that influenced my opinion. And I do have the opinion that same-sex couples should be allowed to marry.
And it would be fair to call you a gay rights activist.
I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that term. There have been opportunities that I have had to state my opinion on subjects. I will, as I said, I do believe same-sex couples should be allowed to marry.
Well, your CV identifies that the Advocate magazine awarded you or bestowed upon you an award for being one of our best and brightest activists. Is that right?
Yes, they did, but that wasn't something that I applied for or sort of sought in any way, but that was their opinion.
But your activity in this field qualified you for that award.
Yes, well, my activity was to have done research on these topics for almost 20 years, yes.
And you contributed to No on 8, Equality for All in the Proposition 8 campaign, did you not?
I did.
Now, your primary academic focus, Professor Badgett, is essentially sexual orientation and economics. Is that correct?
Well, there are different ways to define it. I'm a labor economist by training. That's sort of the broad field that I'm in. My specialty within that field has been in terms of thinking about sexual orientation differences. That's one piece of it, yes.
And what does that term sexual orientation mean?
Well, it has different meanings in academic research. I'm not sure what kind of context you're asking me about.
Well, are there definitional problems with the concept of sexual orientation?
No, I don't think there are problems with it.
Are there different dimensions of the concept of sexual orientation?
Yes, yes, there are different dimensions.
Would you describe them?
The dimensions that are often found in the research I'm aware of concern differences in self-identity. There's a dimension related to behavior, whether someone's, the sex of someone's sex partners. There are dimensions related to attraction.
Would you turn to tab 4 in your binder? That is a document published by the Williams Institute called, Best Practices for Asking Questions About Sexual Orientation on Surveys. It appears to have been published in November 2009. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, I am.
And did you have anything to do with its development and publication?
Yes, I was a member of the group of scholars who prepared it, and I was one of the editors of this document.
Your Honor, I would like to move the document, which is
DX 1108.
Yes, Your Honor, into evidence.
No objection.
Very well, DX 1108 is admitted.
Dr. Badgett, I would like to refer your attention to page 6 of the document. And in the middle of the page, the heading reads, Conceptually, sexual orientation has 3 major dimensions. And then it lists the 3 major dimensions in succeeding paragraphs: sexual attraction, sexual behavior, and self-identification. Are those the dimensions that you are referring to a moment ago in your testimony?
Yes, those are the same ones.
Now, it's true then that self-identification is not always in concordance with sexual attraction or sexual behavior. Is that correct?
It is for most people.
And again, referring now to the bottom of page 6, where the report states, sizable numbers of people reporting only same-sex attraction and or behavior self-identity as heterosexual or bisexual. Similarly, sizable numbers of those who identify as gay or lesbian report some sexual partners of a different sex and or some level of attraction to different sex partners. Some people may not be currently sexually active, yet have an orientation identity when asked. Self-identification is particularly important for social, political, and economic studies. You agree with those propositions, don't you?
Yes.
Now, how does a conscientious researcher determine what to ask in a survey question in the light of these different dimensions of sexual orientation?
Well, it might vary as to the subject that you are studying. There is no single answer to that question.
But one would have to assess the purpose of the survey and determine the questions based upon the dimension of sexual orientation that is most pertinent to the survey. Is that accurate?
In my experience, if one is fortunate enough to have options, then yes, you would have to think about those kinds of questions.
Now, are you familiar with the 1992 National Health and Social Life Survey?
Yes.
Okay. Do you recall it well enough to describe its reflection on this issue, the different dimensions of sexual orientation?
Well, I definitely recall that they asked about those different dimensions in separate questions.